The crowd covers their noses as a sickening stench fills the church. The corpse of King William the Conqueror has just exploded during his funeral, spraying horrified onlookers with putrid entrails and blood. Sounds insane, right? A king's body literally burst open, unleashing an intolerable stench that sent mourners running in disgust. And guess what? That's just a taste of how gruesome England's royal history gets. From exploding corpses and murdered princes to beheaded queens, the timeline of England's kings and queens is darker and more twisted than any horror movie. Welcome to the blood-soaked saga of the English monarchy. Today we're diving into 1,000 years of betrayal, intrigue, and brutal power plays among the kings and queens of England. Why should you care about a bunch of old monarchs? Because these real-life Game of Thrones stories shape the world we live in, and they reveal the extremes people will go to for power. By the end of this video, you'll see how understanding this epic tale can give us insight into human ambition, and maybe make you glad you live now and not back then. So stick around because the craziest twists are yet to come, including a king who lost his head, literally, and changed the fate of the monarchy forever. Ready? Let's go. Our journey begins in 1066 with blood and thunder. England's Saxon king, Harold II, marches onto the battlefield at Hastings to face Duke William of Normandy. Arrows darken the sky. Legend says King Harold gets shot through the eye with an arrow, falling as William's Norman army slaughters the English forces around him. Thousands lie dead in a single day. William, soon known as the Conqueror, seizes the throne, but he doesn't stop the killing there. To crush resistance in the north, William burns villages, massacres peasants, even reportedly drives some survivors to cannibalism. This is the brutal price of conquest. Being king isn't just wearing a crown, it's won and kept by violence. William the Conqueror rules with an iron fist until his death in 1087, which, as you saw, ended with a bang and a splatter. His bloated corpse burst apart when priests tried to stuff it into a stone coffin too small for his body. Imagine the shock. The king who brought England to its knees left mourners gagging on his exploding guts. Unbelievable. But the chaos was only beginning. William's son, King William II, William Rufus, took the throne next. He didn't last long. One day, while hunting in a royal forest, an arrow struck him in the chest out of nowhere. The king collapsed dead, with the arrow piercing his lungs. Was it a freak accident or an assassination by his own men? Many suspected William's younger brother, who conveniently rushed to seize the crown as King Henry I, had a hand in this accident. In the scramble for power, brothers might kill brothers and call it an act of God. Dark, right? And it gets darker. Henry I's reign brought its own tragedy. In 1120, Henry's only son and heir drowned in the White Ship disaster, a drunken late-night shipwreck in the English Channel. The prince's ship hit a rock and sank, tossing nobles into freezing water. Dozens of screaming passengers drowned in the dark sea. Henry's son was last seen trying to save his half-sister, only to vanish beneath the waves. With his heir gone, Henry had a succession crisis on his hands. When Henry I died from overeating lampreys, basically eels, until his belly burst, England plunged into civil war over who would be the next ruler. They call this period the Anarchy, and for good reason. Henry's daughter Matilda was supposed to be queen, but her cousin Stephen grabbed the crown. Bad idea. Matilda was furious and raised an army, and suddenly England was torn between two monarchs. Brother fought brother, castles burned, famine spread. Chroniclers wrote that Christ and his saints slept. Basically, all hell broke loose. Ordinary people were caught in the middle, suffering horribly as barons built makeshift castles and tortured anyone for money or loyalty. The war dragged on for nearly 19 years of bloodshed and terror. Finally, Matilda's son became king, Henry II, in 1154, restoring a tense peace. But if you think that ended the violence, think again. King Henry II had a temper as legendary as his empire. He controlled England and half of France, but couldn't control his own rage. Frustrated with his former friend, Archbishop Thomas Becket, Henry is said to have shouted, "Will no one rid me of this troublesome priest?" His knights took it as an order. On a cold December day in 1170, 4 knights stormed Canterbury Cathedral. Imagine the scene. Becket, in his holy robes, backing up against the altar as steel-clad knights close in. They slam their swords into him, splitting his skull. Brain matter and blood spill onto the cathedral floor as the archbishop collapses, dead at the foot of the altar, all over a feud with the king. Shocking? Absolutely. Medieval Europe was horrified by the sacrilege. Henry II had to do penance, but the damage was done. The message was clear. Defy the king and prepare to die horribly. Ironically, Henry II's own family would prove just as treacherous. His ambitious sons, including Richard the Lionheart and Prince John, turned against him, egged on by their fiery mother, Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine. Picture it, the king's own wife and sons plotting rebellion, teaming up with France to fight Henry. This family feud plunged the kingdom into further conflict. In the end, Henry II died a broken man, reportedly whispering, "Shame, shame on a conquered king," as he realized even his sons betrayed him. Ouch. The crown passed to Richard I, the Lionheart, a legendary warrior king famed for fighting in the Crusades. Richard spent barely any time in England. He was too busy swinging swords in the Holy Land and dueling Saladin in massive battles. He was brave, bold, and brutal. At one point, Richard massacred thousands of prisoners in Acre, having their throats slit because negotiations dragged on. This was a king who bathed in blood on the battlefield. But even the Lionheart wasn't invincible. In 1199, while besieging a castle in France for some petty squabble, Richard let his guard down. Twang! An enemy crossbowman fired a random arrow that struck Richard in the shoulder. The wound turned gangrenous. The mighty Lionheart died in agony from a festering infection, killed not by a famous enemy, but by a nameless soldier's lucky shot. Talk about an anticlimactic end for a legend. Power now fell to Richard's scheming brother, King John. Yes, the villain from Robin Hood. John was so bad that even his own barons revolted. He lost almost all the French lands his father had gained. He taxed people to starvation. And rumor has it, he murdered his own nephew Arthur, a 16-year-old rival claimant, by drowning him in secret or maybe stabbing him and dumping the body. Accounts vary, but it's pretty clear John had blood on his hands. His tyranny got so out of hand that in 1215 his barons forced him to sign the Magna Carta, basically shoving a contract in the king's face at sword point to make him guarantee rights and laws. John signed it under duress, but promptly ignored it. He died a year later from dysentery, basically violent diarrhea, which he supposedly contracted after gorging on peaches and cider. A miserable end for a miserable king. The Middle Ages rolled on with one bloody drama after another. King Edward I, 1272 to 1307, was a formidable ruler who conquered Wales and hammered Scotland. He was ruthless. When the famous Scottish rebel William Wallace was captured, Edward had him hanged, drawn, and quartered in 1305. That's one of the most horrific execution methods ever conceived. Wallace was hanged until half dead, cut down, his genitals sliced off and his belly sliced open, his intestines yanked out while he was still alive in unbearable agony. Finally, mercifully, he was beheaded and his body chopped into 4 pieces to be displayed. Yes, this is how King Edward dealt with his enemies. The brutality knew no bounds, all to keep the crown secure. But sometimes the call was coming from inside the house. Enter King Edward II, Edward I's son, who ruled from 1307. Edward II was not like his father. He preferred handsome young male favorites over war or governance, and the barons hated him for it. His own wife, Queen Isabella, known as the She-Wolf of France, teamed up with her lover Roger Mortimer to invade England and overthrow Edward II in 1326. Edward was captured and locked in a damp castle cell, and here comes one of the grisliest royal murders ever. Legend says that on Isabella's orders, assassins held Edward down and shoved a red-hot poker up his anus. Yes, a burning iron rod straight up the rear, allegedly to burn him from the inside out without outward marks. The screams were said to echo through the castle. Edward II died in excruciating pain, killed by his estranged queen and her henchmen. True or not, some historians debate it, this story became infamous. a symbol of just how nightmarishly vicious the fight for England's crown could be. Edward II's son, Edward III, eventually took the throne and had his mother's lover executed. You can bet revenge was served cold for that red-hot poker incident. Under Edward III, England plunged into the 100 Years' War against France. Battles like Crécy and Poitiers in the 1340 to 1350 saw English longbowmen mow down thousands of French knights, turning fields into bloody killing grounds. During Edward's reign, the Black Death also struck, 1348, killing perhaps a third of the population in ghastly fashion. Fevers, black boils oozing pus and blood. A disaster beyond anyone's control. Talk about apocalyptic times. Edward III died of a stroke in 1377, passing the crown to his 10-year-old grandson, Richard II. King Richard II's life was cursed by violence from the start. As a boy, he watched the peasants' revolts of 1381, where angry peasants stormed London. Richard, only 14, faced them in person. The rebels even broke into the Tower of London and beheaded the Archbishop of Canterbury, sticking the head on a spike. Imagine that trauma for a kid king. Although Richard put down that revolt, he grew up erratic and autocratic. Eventually, his own cousin, Henry Bolingbroke, overthrew him in 1399. Richard was imprisoned and likely starved to death in captivity. Some say he was left to die, gnawing on his own hands in hunger and despair. The Plantagenet family, which had ruled for centuries, was now splitting into factions. Cue one of history's most notorious family wars, the Wars of the Roses. This was a bloody contest between two branches of the royal family, the Yorks and Lancasters, both Plantagenet descendants, for the throne. Kings were toppled and killed one after another. Henry Bolingbroke became Henry IV and died fairly normally. But his son Henry V picked the war with France back up and won the epic Battle of Agincourt in 1415. Agincourt was medieval slaughter at its finest. Rain-soaked fields, armored knights stuck in mud, and English archers raining arrows that pierced through armor. When it was over, thousands of French lay in pools of blood and mud, and Henry V was hailed a hero. But victory was fleeting. Henry V died young of disease, and his infant son, Henry VI, inherited the crown. Henry VI grew up to be gentle and pious, and utterly unfit for the throne. Under his watch, England lost nearly all its French territories, and at home, powerful nobles sniffed weakness. The result? Civil war. The Wars of the Roses exploded in full fury, Lancaster versus York. Armies of relatives butchered each other for years. Henry VI was overthrown by the Yorkist Edward IV, briefly restored, then captured again. In 1471, Henry VI was murdered in the Tower of London, likely on the orders of Edward IV, who wanted to remove the rival king once and for all. They probably snuck into his cell and quietly smothered him or stabbed him. The details were hushed up, but the result was a royal corpse in the tower. When King Edward IV himself died in 1483, the crown passed to his 12-year-old son, Edward V. But the boy and his little brother Richard, Duke of York, barely got a taste of power. Their uncle, Richard III, declared the boys illegitimate and locked them in the tower for their protection. Spoiler, they never came out. The two young princes, aged 12 and 9, simply vanished. To this day, it's one of history's greatest mysteries, but most fingers point at Uncle Richard. It's believed Richard III had his own nephews murdered, possibly smothered with pillows as they slept, to secure his throne. Imagine, two innocent princes trapped in a dark tower room, whispering prayers in the night as assassins approach. Then, silence. And they're gone. Years later, two small skeletons were found buried under a staircase in the tower, fueling the grim legend. Richard III got his crown through the ultimate act of betrayal, a family child murder. Karma came for Richard III on a battlefield. In 1485, Henry Tudor, a Lancaster claimant, challenged him for the throne at the Battle of Bosworth Field. Richard III fought ferociously, but his allies deserted him. Surrounded by enemies, Richard was knocked off his horse. As legend tells it, he cried out, "My kingdom for a horse," in desperation. It didn't save him. He was hacked to death by Tudor swords. When they found Richard's body, it was horribly mutilated, deep cuts to his skull, his helmet shattered, and even stab wounds in his buttocks. The victors mocked him, even in death. The last Plantagenet king was stripped naked, slung over a horse, and paraded off in disgrace. After 30 years of carnage, the Wars of the Roses ended with Henry Tudor crowned King Henry VII. At last, some relative peace. For now. The Tudor dynasty was about to turn the insanity up to 10. Henry VII stabilized the realm somewhat and died of natural causes in 1509, passing the crown to his son, Henry VIII, a king who would become famous for his bloodlust, especially toward his own wives. Henry VIII started as a charismatic young king, but when he couldn't get the male heir he desperately wanted, he broke all the rules. He divorced the Queen, Catherine of Aragon, against the Pope's orders, declaring himself head of a new Church of England. Basically, Henry split the country's religion apart just so he could remarry and try for a son. That was only the beginning of his tyrannical pivot. Over his 38-year reign, Henry VIII married 6 times, and 2 of those wives he executed in cold blood. Imagine the scene: May 1536, Tower of London. Henry's second wife, Queen Anne Boleyn, is led to a scaffold after being falsely accused of adultery and treason. She's scared, but composed. A French swordsman is hired to make her death quick. With one swift stroke, he slices off Anne's head. Henry had dumped his devoted wife just because she gave him a daughter, the future Elizabeth I, instead of a son. 2 wives later, in 1542, Henry did it again. His 5th wife, Catherine Howard, barely 18 or 19, was dragged to the chopping block for alleged infidelity. Her slender neck met the executioner's axe, and another young queen's lifeless head dropped into a basket. Can you imagine being Henry's wife? It was a deadly gamble. Henry VIII didn't stop at wives. He executed trusted advisors, like Sir Thomas More, and hundreds of others he deemed traitors. Monasteries were dissolved. Some monks who resisted were hanged or disemboweled. The man was ruthless. By the time Henry died in 1547, obese, diseased, and rotting from festering leg ulcers, so much blood had been spilled that people must have wondered if the chaos would ever end. In a morbid twist of fate, Henry's bloated corpse reputedly burst as well. His coffin leaked fluids and, according to legend, dogs licked up his blood. Truly gruesome. After Henry VIII's bloody reign, his 3 children each took a turn. Edward VI, his 9-year-old son, became king and ruled a short 6 years. Edward was a sickly boy. He coughs blood, gets feverish, and dies at 15, likely of tuberculosis. No battles, no murders, just a sad, quiet death. But his death unleashed a succession crisis that brings more bloodshed. Powerful men place Henry's Protestant niece, Lady Jane Grey, on the throne to keep Henry's Catholic daughter off. Sweet Jane is just 16 years old, intelligent and gentle, and suddenly she's declared Queen of England in 1553. She never wanted it. For 9 days, Jane is queen, a teenage girl caught in a lethal political game. Then, Mary Tudor, Henry VIII's eldest daughter, rides into London with popular support. The people rally to Mary, and Jane is imprisoned in the Tower. Mary, now Queen Mary I, agonizes but ultimately signs her teenage cousin's death warrant. In February 1554, Jane Grey is led to a scaffold. She's so small and trembling that the executioner asks her forgiveness, which she grants. She blindfolds herself and gropes for the block, placing her head down. With one stroke, the executioner beheads the young, 9 days queen. Jane's short life is snuffed out to satisfy royal politics. How's that for graphic royal tragedy? Queen Mary I quickly earns an even darker reputation. A fervent Catholic, she's determined to reverse the Protestant reforms and save her subjects' souls by burning Protestants alive as heretics. During Mary's 5-year reign, around 300 men and women, even some elderly and disabled, are tied to stakes and set on fire. Imagine the screams echoing as crowds watch neighbors and loved ones roast in the flames. The smell of burnt flesh filled the air across England. For this, Mary became known as Bloody Mary. She thought these executions would cleanse England of sin but instead, they earned her hatred and fear. Mary also had her own cousin, the teenage Lady Jane, executed as we saw, and even locked up her half-sister Elizabeth in the Tower for a time. Mary's reign was short and bloody. She died in 1558, likely from ovarian cancer, miserable and childless. The country literally cheered as her younger half-sister took the throne. That sister was Elizabeth I, daughter of Anne Boleyn, and she would become one of England's greatest monarchs. But Elizabeth's path was riddled with danger. Being a female ruler in a man's world, she faced endless plots. In 1586, a major conspiracy to assassinate Elizabeth and put her Catholic cousin Mary, Queen of Scots, on the throne was uncovered. Elizabeth reluctantly agreed to execute Mary, who had been her prisoner for 19 years. The execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, in 1587 was grisly. The executioner's first axe blow missed and hit the back of Mary's head. The horrified crowd gasped. The second blow struck true, decapitating her. Well, almost. He had to saw through the remaining sinew with a third strike. When the executioner lifted Mary's severed head by the hair to show the crowd, her head dropped from his hand, her wig had come off, and her head tumbled on the floor. To make the scene even more ghastly, Mary's little dog had hidden in her skirts and now emerged covered in blood, whimpering by her headless body. It's the kind of nightmare image you can't make up. Elizabeth later said she regretted Mary's execution, but by then the deed was done. Elizabeth went on to defeat the Spanish Armada in 1588, the big attempted invasion by Spain, where English fire ships and storms wrecked the Spanish fleet. Many Spanish sailors drowned or were slaughtered after shipwrecks on English and Irish shores. Elizabeth's reign had its share of blood, but largely she brought stability. When Queen Elizabeth of France died peacefully in 1603, the end of the Tudor line, the English people had enjoyed 45 years under a queen who managed to survive the assassins and usurpers, a rarity in this violent timeline. For the next chapter, the crown passed to the Stuarts, and things got wild in a new way. King James I, who was already James VI of Scotland, united the English and Scottish crowns. He's the guy who sponsored the Bible translation and loved witch hunting, but perhaps the scariest event of his reign was the Gunpowder Plot of 1605. A group of Catholic conspirators led by Guy Fawkes hid 36 barrels of gunpowder under Parliament, aiming to blow King James sky high during the state opening. If they had succeeded, King, Lords, and Commons would have been blasted to pieces, a colossal bloody explosion to change history. But the plot was foiled at the last minute. Fawkes was caught red-handed. The punishment? Oh, nothing mild. Guy Fawkes and his co-plotters were sentenced to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. We touched on this horror earlier. It's so barbaric it's worth imagining one last time, if you have the stomach. On execution day, they hanged Fawkes until he was half dead, then cut him down. While he was still conscious, the executioner sliced open his abdomen, yanked out his intestines and genitals, and burned them before his very eyes. Finally, mercifully, he was decapitated, and his body chopped into 4 parts to be displayed as a warning. All of this for attempting to kill the king. Kings and queens now face not just scheming relatives, but increasingly the anger of their people, and that anger would soon boil over. Fast forward to the reign of King Charles I, James's son. Charles I believed fiercely in the divine right of kings, basically that he could do whatever he wanted, and Parliament had no right to limit his power. He tried to rule without Parliament, squeezed the country for money, and imposed religious policies that many subjects hated. People murmured that Charles was acting like a tyrant. Before long, murmurs turned to musket fire. Civil war erupted in 1642 between the king's supporters, the royalists, and the parliamentarians, led by Oliver Cromwell. This war was absolutely brutal. Families were split. Battlefields like Marston Moor and Naseby were littered with the corpses of Englishmen killed by other Englishmen. After years of bloodshed, the parliamentarians won. And then came the unthinkable. In 1649, they put King Charles I on trial for treason. A reigning king accused by his own people. Found guilty, Charles was sentenced to death. On a cold January morning, Charles stepped onto a scaffold outside Whitehall Palace. He wore 2 shirts so he wouldn't shiver. He didn't want the crowd thinking he was afraid. He gave a brave last speech, then laid his neck on the block. The executioner severed the king's head with one clean blow and held it up to the silent crowd. Shockwaves rippled across Europe. A people had killed their own king. It was a monumental moment in history. No more monarchy, at least for a while. England became a republic, the Commonwealth, with Oliver Cromwell eventually ruling as Lord Protector. But even in victory, the blood didn't stop. Cromwell brutally crushed those who resisted, especially in Ireland, where his troops slaughtered entire towns. Kings, it turned out, weren't the only source of bloodshed. The people, once roused, could be just as ruthless. Cromwell died of natural causes in 1658, and without his heavy hand, the Republic unraveled. By 1660, the English were done with republican chaos and ready to bring back the monarchy. As long as the new king understood, he couldn't act like an absolute tyrant. Enter King Charles II, son of the executed Charles I. He was invited back from exile in a restoration of the crown. Charles II was a flamboyant, party-loving king, very different from his stern father. Under Charles II, the pendulum swung back to fun, maybe too much fun. His court was notorious for wild parties and mistresses, hardly pious, but England mostly sighed in relief to have stability again. Still, fate threw disasters at Charles's reign. The Great Plague of 1665 killed tens of thousands in London, so many dead that corpses piled in mass. Graves, the smell of death everywhere. Then the Great Fire of London in 1666 burned much of the city down. So, Charles's era had its apocalyptic vibes, though not directly of his making. Charles II himself died peacefully in 1685, likely from a stroke, converting to Catholicism on his deathbed. A secret twist, since that was still a big no-no for an English king. He left the throne to his brother James II, a devout Catholic. But England had had enough of sectarian conflict. When James II had a son, who would be raised Catholic, the Protestant English elite panicked at the idea of a Catholic dynasty. In 1688, they invited James's Protestant daughter, Mary, and her Dutch husband, William of Orange, to take the throne. William landed with an army, but there was almost no resistance. James II's forces melted away, and James fled into exile after basically losing his nerve. This glorious revolution was relatively bloodless in England, though fighting raged in Ireland afterward. William III and Mary II became co-rulers, and they accepted a Bill of Rights from Parliament, permanently limiting royal power. The message was clear: no more absolute monarchs. The king or queen must bow to the laws of Parliament. This was huge for the ordinary people of England, who would never again be mere playthings of a tyrant with a crown. Mary II died young, and William III carried on alone until 1702, dying from complications after a horse tripped on a molehill, believe it or not. Next came Queen Anne, Mary's sister, who ruled through 1714. Anne oversaw the unification of England and Scotland into Great Britain in 1707. A peaceful union, imagine that. But Anne's personal life was tragic. 17 pregnancies and no surviving children. One by one, her babies died in miscarriages, stillbirths, or early childhood. The heartbreak was immense. When her only son to reach age 11 died, Anne was shattered. She herself died at 49, obese and gout-stricken. With no heir, the crown had to go to a distant relative from Germany, the start of the Hanoverian dynasty. The Hanoverians, George I, George II, George III, and so on, shifted the monarchy into a new era. These kings and queens gradually became constitutional monarchs, no longer wielding absolute power. And thankfully, the massive blood spilling for the crown died down. But drama, that remained in different forms. George I spoke little English and faced revolts from those who preferred a different claimant, the Jacobites. But he died naturally. George II famously died on the toilet in 1760. Yes, the king likely had an aortic aneurysm while using the chamber pot and was found dead on the throne, literally. Not a glorious way to go, but at least not a violent murder. George III reigned 60 years, presiding over the American Revolution, bad for him, and defeating Napoleon, good for him. He also suffered from bouts of madness, now thought to be a disease called porphyria. At times, the king babbled nonsense for hours, or had to be straitjacketed while he raved. A very undignified situation. Doctors in those days tried some pretty brutal cures on George III, including blistering his skin to draw out humors. It was more torture than treatment. He eventually went blind, deaf, and completely deranged, dying in 1820 after years locked away insane while his son ruled as regent. His son, George IV, and later William IV, had their scandals and excesses. George IV was a glutton and drunk who maybe hastened his own death. But the next big era was Queen Victoria, 1837 to 1901. Victoria's reign was long and relatively peaceful at home, but she survived at least 7 assassination attempts. Disgruntled men fired pistols at her carriage more than once. One guy even struck her on the head with a cane. Each time, Victoria kept her cool and even laughed off some attempts. No would-be assassin ever managed to seriously hurt the queen. A far cry from earlier centuries when successful regicide was a real threat. It's as if the violence had moved off the royals themselves and more into public life, like the world wars that came later. By the 20th century, British monarchs were largely symbolic leaders, but they still saw drama. King Edward VIII in 1936 nearly blew up the monarchy, not with a bomb, but by abdicating the throne to marry the woman he loved, Wallis Simpson, an American divorcee. It caused a scandal and constitutional crisis, but at least no one was executed over it. Edward's brother became King George VI, the stuttering king from the King's Speech movie, led Britain through World War II's darkest days as bombs rained on London, and died in 1952 from illness, lung cancer after heavy smoking. His daughter, Queen Elizabeth II, would reign for 70 peaceful years. No usurpers, no civil wars, only the relentless scrutiny of the modern media. When Elizabeth II died in 2022 at the age of 96, it marked the end of an era. She was the last link to a century that saw world wars and the end of the British Empire, yet her passing was quiet and dignified, a far cry from the violent finales of so many earlier monarchs. Today, King Charles III sits on the throne. He faces controversy and challenges, family dramas, anyone, but nothing like the life and death struggles of the past. In modern Britain, if people don't like the monarch, they complain or joke on Twitter. They don't raise an army or storm the tower. Thank goodness. The crown has endured by evolving, from a bloody free-for-all prize to a symbolic institution under rule of law. So, what can we take away from this millennium of mayhem? The timeline of England's kings and queens is basically a roller coaster through a haunted house, full of dark twists, deadly surprises, and graphic climaxes. We've seen ambition turn family members into mortal enemies. We've seen how absolute power can lead to absolute madness, and how ordinary people eventually said, enough, and curbed that power. This bloody journey teaches us about the cost of pride, greed, and fanatical belief. It shows that even the mightiest can fall in the most grotesque ways, whether by a peasant's arrow, a spouse's betrayal, or the righteous fury of a nation. The English monarchy's story is one of survival against the odds. Despite all the beheadings, rebellions, and literal explosions, the institution of the crown adapted and endured. From swords and axes to ballots and tabloids, the fight for power got tamer, thankfully. Today's royal family might face scandals or social media storms, but at least they're not imprisoning siblings in towers or incinerating rivals. We've come a long way. And by looking back, we appreciate living in a time when political transitions don't require a body count. History's dark chapters shine a light on how precious stability and rule of law really are. If you enjoyed this wild ride through royal history, make sure to hit that like button to let us know. Subscribe for more unbelievable true stories from the past. We have plenty more drama and intrigue coming your way. And leave a comment. Which royal story blew your mind the most? Was it the exploding corpse, the princes in the tower, or the king who lost his head? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Thank you for watching till the end. You're officially a brave soul for surviving all these gory details. Stay curious, stay brave, and we'll see you in the next video. And remember, those who don't learn from history might not lose their heads literally, but they definitely miss out on some mind-blowing stories. Until next time.